The Carpenter and the Cradle. A History Weaver Adventure, Book 1, by Connie Worden. Read by the author. Chapter 14. Mum was in a good mood today, Fern thought. She hated the fact that when her mum was in a good mood, Fern cringed as though expecting a new blow to fall. Mum's good moods tended to be the calm before the storm, however. The feeling of dread could also be coming from a certain curly, brown-haired, blue-eyed girl hiding out in the family's storage shed. Wouldn't this just be the time they'd find out? Fern wondered how long she could live with the constant churning in her stomach of perpetual adrenaline before she developed an ulcer. At her young age yet. But it was almost surprising she didn't have one yet. The feeling of stress was her nearly ever-present companion. Or maybe she did have an ulcer. Maybe that was why her stomach agonized her on a regular basis. And that could also explain the random nausea she often experienced, for no good reason. "Fern, have you done your piano yet today?" Mum called almost cheerfully. "I'll start right now," Fern called back, quickly heading for the practice room. She usually liked to dawdle and put it off as long as she could possibly get away with it, especially in summer, when there were other things to do, though she couldn't use homework as her excuse as she could during the school year. But she didn't want to do anything to disturb her mother's sunny side-up mood just now, particularly with her secret of that certain curly brown-haired, blue-eyed girl hiding out in the family's storage shed. She sat down on the piano bench and opened her practice book at random. Mom never knew what Fern was supposed to be practicing. As long as Fern was making noise at the piano that sounded more or less like what it was supposed to be, and she did it for the required hour a day, Mom didn't bother about it. She'd never taken a music lesson in her life and had the proverbial tin ear, so it wasn't hard to please her. Joanna had been determined that her kids would have all the advantages she'd never had, though Fern had a hard time seeing the drudgery of music lessons and daily practice times as any kind of advantage. Fortunately for Fern, given her mother's determination to make a musical prodigy of her, she hadn't inherited her mother's tin ear. Instead, music came easily and naturally to her as it had to her dad. In fact, if it hadn't been for the have-to of it, she might have enjoyed learning music, but the discipline of it had quite spoiled it for her. Nevertheless, she was glad that it came as easily as it did, considering the amount of time she was forced to devote to it. She ran her fingers mindlessly over the runs of one scale after another, all the while thinking, "At least I don't have to do violin during the summer." Her head was beginning to hurt. The headaches were becoming more frequent, along with the stomach pains. "Let's face it," Fern told herself sternly. "You're just a mess. You're falling apart at 14. Of course, scolding herself in that way was never helpful, but she couldn't seem to help it either. Where her mother left off lecturing her, Fern took over. Her fingers found a false note that threw her off. She stopped abruptly. Where had she been? She couldn't remember. She didn't even know what scale she'd been playing. The motion came so automatically she didn't have to think. Maybe she'd better do some real practicing. After all, her lesson was tomorrow, and her teacher would expect her pieces to be played, if not perfectly, at least well. At least well enough to make it look as though she'd definitely put the time into practicing them. Besides, she'd actually have to think and focus on the pieces she was trying to learn for the fall recital. So that would be something to take her mind off all the things she'd rather not think about. Joanna's face poked around the corner of the practice room. "Fern, you had a phone call. I told them you were practicing and could call them back." "Who was it?" Fern asked eagerly. "I'll tell you when you're finished your hour. Don't worry, I'm timing." Fern sighed, disgruntled. Not telling her who called her was her mom's way of making sure she didn't find any excuse to leave her practice time. If she didn't know who it was, she couldn't say that the call must have been urgent and that she should return it immediately. It had happened before, and Fern had managed to get out of her practice here and there in that way, but her mom was wise to her. The hour dragged on, though it went quicker than it may have ordinarily with all the thinking material she had to work on. Most of it wasn't thinking about things that made her happy, however. The usual tension that hung around her household formed the background to most of her thoughts, without her even realizing how much of a toll it was taking on her. Today, however, she spent most of her time worrying how she would get Georgie to move out of the storage shed before she was found out. Her stay there was meant to be a very short one, as far as Fern understood. They'd gotten away with it so far, but it was dragging on now, and no other solutions were proving to be forthcoming. Georgie had been living in the shed for the better part of a week, and Fern wondered how much longer it would have to go on. Every day she wasn't discovered was just one day closer to her eventual discovery, the way Fern saw it. Unless by some miracle they managed to find another location for Georgie, and she managed to get out before anyone knew about her presence in the shed. Fern felt bad for Georgie, of course, but her own problems were so immediate in her mind that she almost had no space in her brain to worry about Georgie's. Fern's alarm buzzed, and she went to find her mum to learn who had called her earlier. "Your time's not up," Mum declared firmly. Fern didn't want to argue, as that may push Mum out of her good mood, but the words rose to her lips without her volition. "I set the alarm right when I started." "We're going by my time, and you have 5 minutes left. Go on, back you go. Come on, what's another 5 minutes? Just go do it, and it's done." The argument could go either way. What was 5 minutes of practicing? Well then, what difference did 5 minutes of missing practice make? But Fern knew from experience not to push it. She sat down at the piano again and immediately began playing something, anything, it didn't matter what. But Mum wouldn't begin her timer until she heard those first notes. Joanna was a stickler for some things. Well, a stickler for all things, really. Exactly 5 minutes later, according to Fern's watch, she went to find Mum again. "It was June who called you. Who else? Those girls seem to have no chores or duties to do ever. They have unlimited access to all the phone time they want too, I suppose." Fern stopped the sound of her Mum's continuous, rumbling grumble by picking up the phone and punching in June's number. She wasn't allowed time on her cell phone for ordinary calls, just emergencies. That meant Mum would unavoidably hear every word Fern said to June as she hovered in the kitchen, watching Fern closely from narrowed eyes. Fern still felt nervous that something she might end up saying to June would send Mum's good mood crashing down. Or, much worse, that she'd accidentally say something that aroused Mum's suspicions about Georgie, which was undoubtedly what June was calling about. But June had other news. "Hey, Fern, what are you doing this afternoon? Do you want to come with me and July to meet the Lyons family later? They're the ones I told you about, the ones making the old cherry barn into a house. There's that girl, Coral, who's our age. Well, my age. I always forget you're younger and ahead a grade. Coral will be in our class when school starts. You should come meet her. She's really nice." "I will if I can," Fern said uncertainly. She held the handset to her shoulder, trying to muffle the receiver as much as possible, and asked her mother, "June wants to know if I can go meet their new neighbors later this afternoon. She says they have a girl who will be in our class at school, so it would be nice if I make them welcome, too. And I just finished my practice, and I got all my chores done this morning already, so I probably can, right, Mum?" "That's not up to you to tell me what you're allowed or not allowed to do, Fern," Mum said. The edge was back in her tone. It took so little some days. "But I suppose you can," Mum finished a little reluctantly. "As long as you're home and plenty of time for dinner. I need you to watch Christopher so I can make dinner. He's always such a little terror when he's underfoot, and I'm trying to get something done around the house." "Okay, I will," Fern said happily, partially to her mum and partially into the phone.